And we're shooting a scene in Arnold's, the drive-in, an interior scene. We had a little break in rehearsing the scene, getting ready to shoot it. And Anson went to go get a cup of coffee. He comes back with this weird expression on his face. And he says, this guy just walked in and he says, he looks just like, and I won't say who yet. He looks just like so-and-so. And we're going, yeah, right. This guy's coming here to see us. Right. We're laughing, you know. A minute or two later, we see a guy walk in with a young boy. He's got sunglasses on, and we're going, holy shit. It's John Lennon.
These youngsters from Liverpool, England.
Hello, I'm Jack, and you're listening to the Here, There, and Everywhere podcast, an interview show about the Beatles' influence in the past, present, and future across the universe and across generations. Don Most has an interesting story to tell. He's experienced a phenomenon that few people have. On set, while playing the character Ralphie on the show Happy Days, he stumbled into a Beatle. John and Julian Lennon were visiting the Happy Days set for the day in 1974. Don, the entire crew, John and Julian then took a famous photograph together, and the story behind the photo hasn't been talked about too much until now. Thank you for tuning back into the Here, There, and Everywhere podcast. I'm your host, Jack Lawless. I'm here with the legendary Don Most, who, as you all know, played Ralph on the show Happy Days, and who is also a huge Beatles fan. Don Most, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's a pleasure.
Oh, mine. Thanks for having me, Jack. Appreciate it.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm a little like jet lag. I just came back from being away for about a week. I was in Vegas for an autograph show, and then I went to Pittsburgh. There was a screening and a panel discussion of a movie that I'm in called When George Got Murdered, which the movie's about right in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder. Interesting. So anyway, that probably coming out in May, the end of May, on either Amazon or on Hulu. Anyway,
Cool.
So I just got back and I'm kind of like readjusting, to the time and all of that.
Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, my absolute pleasure. Thank you again.
So, Don, can you paint a picture of what life was like for you at the time when you first heard the music of the Beatles?
Okay, well, that was probably, I forget, 1963, something like that. I'm guessing 62 or 63. So I was like 9 or 10 years old, growing up in Brooklyn. And, I started hearing about the Beatles. It was all this, hub going on, a lot of talk here. Oh, you got to hear, there's this new sensation, this band from England called the Beatles. And it was what? The Beatles, I had never heard of them. And everybody's now talking about it, and hearing about it like I was. And built up there was this great buzz and anticipation about getting to see them. I'm sure there were some people who might have known about them already before I did. But, I was in grade school. I was probably in, 5th grade or something like that, 6th grade. And so there was a lot of expectation. I know my sister, who was 2 years older than me, she was probably even a little more excited about it than I was. I was kind of like, the Beatles, I didn't know what to expect. But I just remember there being a lot of anticipation and buzz from everybody hearing them coming, and we were going to finally get to see them on television. And that has to do with another question, probably.
So how did you hear them for the first time?
Yeah, well, the big news was that they were going to be on the Ed Sullivan Show. And, me and my family, we watched the show every Sunday night, probably. And a lot of times we had dinner at my grandparents' house. They also lived in Brooklyn, about a mile away from where we lived. And a lot of times we'd have dinner there and sometimes watch the Ed Sullivan Show there. Sometimes we'd come home and watch it or stay. Well, on this particular night, we all wanted to see it together. And so that was the first time I heard him on the Ed Sullivan Show. And that's
Wow.
probably when a large part of the country, that was the first time they had seen and heard them. The number of people watching that show, I think that night was, I don't know the numbers, but I'm sure it was one of the highest rated shows, in his, of that era. I'm sure it was way up there.
Yeah, absolutely. And you were just a couple blocks away from them, really. I mean, you were in Brooklyn, they were in Manhattan.
Yeah, well, yeah,
Um,
more than a couple of blocks, but
right.
not as the crow flies, I don't know, maybe it was only 12 miles or something like that,
So what were your thoughts when you first heard them?
Good question, because I have to say that I was also initially colored by my there was a bit of a, I don't know, I think from, the older generation, like my parents and grandparents, hearing about the Beatles. And so in their minds, it was, I don't know, I don't want to say a negative thing, but their taste in music obviously was different. And I think it was kind of like, oh, this must be some gimmick, some group. It's just a lot of publicity. It's just some, with the hairdo, because maybe we'd seen some pictures possibly. And so they had kind of a very judgmental attitude, I think, about it. And, I was being young at that time. And so I was a little bit influenced by it. So I probably had a little bit of a, oh yeah, okay, let's see what this is about. We were curious, but it was, this has got to be some kind of, just big publicity stunt or something along those lines. But then I remember when we were watching it, and it was like, I remember going, wow, this is, this is really something different. This is something new. But then they were all, I remember, the audience at the Ed Sullivan Show, they were, filled with a lot of young teenage girls. And they were just going crazy, all standing up, screaming, and then so part of it is like, well, is this kind of set up and staged? That was, but I remember just kind of being mesmerized by them, and inside I'm going, well, I kind of like this, I kind of like this, maybe I didn't want to admit it, it was that
Right.
kind of thing. Like I didn't want to admit it, but it was like, wow, I don't know. I think this is really good, that kind of thing.
So what was it about the Beatles that captivated you?
Well, for me, that early phase of the Beatles, like I said, I thought it was good. I thought it was pretty good. I mean, just it was a combination, but I should say it wasn't until a little bit later when I became a really big fan. When they started going through, they evolved, as we all know, quite a bit.
Mhm.
I mean, it was a band that went through a lot of very progressive changes that they went through. And it was later that I really became a fan. But at that time, I mean, the music, I mean, the writing of their music and the lyrics, I mean, it was incredibly catchy. I mean, I think I remember hearing a story where when they'd be coming up with ideas of music, jamming and riffing, and it was like they wrote it down real quick so they wouldn't forget, and so it was like had to be something that, like in a short hook, that it was a short hook that they'd have to come up with, and they'd have to be really good,
Right. Yeah.
so 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 that's what I think affected me. That it did have such an immediate hook to it that I felt, and that everybody felt, and also it was something about the persona of them. I mean, when you'd watch them perform and hear their music, there was something indescribable that would come through that I couldn't, at that age, and maybe even now, I couldn't, characterize in a very literate way. It was just that it factor of something going on between these people. I think it was the way they gelled together so incredibly well. Their playing, their voices, and great composition of music, really. I think that's what got me. And when I look back at some of those earlier songs now, I think I appreciate them even more so than I did then. But that's with the privilege of having seen the whole arc of the band. So then you could almost appreciate the earlier stuff with a different lens. And so that's why I think I do appreciate the earlier music more now than I did then. But I really loved a lot of the, when I really became a bigger fan was a little bit later.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I share as well, because I grew up with all of the Beatles music already at my fingertips, and I am able to
Yes,
appreciate all of that, just like you
yeah,
said.
yes. You have to imagine seeing the early stuff, in chronology, seeing them and hearing them in chronology. And if you're only seeing that early stuff without the advantage of having seen the later stuff, it might be a little different. I'm sure it would.
Don, when did you first become interested in acting?
Well, I first became interested in sort of pursuing. Originally, for me, it was singing at the beginning. It was more singing. I was 9 years old, and I saw a movie called The Jolson Story about Al Jolson. He was considered the greatest entertainer in the world back in his day in the 20s, 30s. He did the very first talking movie called The Jazz Singer, the original Jazz Singer, starring Al Jolson. And then there was the movie about him that I saw when I was 9 years old. And so then I got his records, and then I started really, I was listening, I was 9 years old. So I was listening to some of the pop music on radio, pop and rock. But then I got really into, at that stage, listening to more of the standards, the American Songbook, and the legends of that, the jazz standards, and Sinatra, and all the great singers of that kind of songbook. But then when I didn't do anything much about it, it was just something I felt inside and had a desire, but I almost didn't want to admit it. But when I was 13 is when my parents saw that I was really, really into it and serious. And they sent me they found a school that was in Manhattan that was for singing, acting, dancing. And I would take the subway from Brooklyn into Manhattan on Saturdays and go to the studio and take lessons. And the acting wasn't as focused for me at that point as the singing. And then the next year, I was 14, and when I was almost turning 15, I got picked to be part of a nightclub act for the summertime that would perform up in the area called the Catskill Mountains, upstate New York, which was a big resort area that had a lot of hotels, and the hotels had nightclubs. So I was up there that whole summer, part of this nightclub act, singing probably 4 or 5 shows a week, all summer long.
Wow.
And so I was, I was really excited about it. But then it was the following year when I turned around 16, where that's when all of a sudden something shifted for me, and my focus really zeroed in on acting. And I wanted to put the music aside for a while, because I started really getting into movies at the time, and going to see a lot of movies. And I started seeing, there were some great movies back then in the late 60s, seeing Dustin Hoffman in The Graduate, or seeing Paul Newman in Cool Hand Luke and The Hustler, and then seeing Jack Nicholson. That was in the movie called 5 Easy Pieces. That really was a turning point for me, seeing Nicholson and these other great actors. And that's when I shifted and went to a school that was really just all about acting, to a workshop, and it was serious acting class. That's when it really started for me.
Can you walk us through your career? What happened after you started going to that workshop?
At that workshop, the teacher had a relationship with a manager that was handling kids and young teenagers, young adults. And I guess when she saw somebody that she thought had some real potential, she would recommend them to this manager. So she introduced me to this manager. Her name was Selma Rubin. She was based out in Forest Hills in Queens, and she wanted to work with me. So she started getting me meetings with some agents, and then I started getting auditions. And at that time, they saw, I was this kid with red hair and little freckles, so they thought, commercials. I was open to anything, but I wanted to do some real acting, movies, television, theater, but commercials. It was big in New York then. It probably still is, and it was a good way to get introduced into the way, because they shoot them like little movies. You spend a day or sometimes 2 days doing these commercials, and it was a way to get a good transition into acting in front of the camera, and you could make some good money. So in the next 4 years, I did 40 commercials, and a lot of them were national commercials. So that was great. And then they sent me on. I came on some Broadway auditions, and I came very close on a few. I didn't quite get them. Came very close to doing the original show, Jesus Christ Superstar.
Wow.
I had like three callbacks for that, and I made it through everything except then when they had the dance part of the audition. I think that's where I didn't quite make it, because I'm not really a dancer, and they wanted you to be able to do that too. But there were a couple of others. I had close calls and a couple of movies, but it was I did a few little TV, very small parts. There wasn't a lot of TV being shot in New York then. It was mainly commercials, soap operas, and theater. So that was how it really got going for me, because that got me into Screen Actors Guild, and I got to work with some good directors, because some of the directors I worked with went on to do films. So it was good training, and like I said, gave me the ability to I made some money so that I could pursue things a little independently, and that's what I wound up doing after my junior year in college. And I did theater in college, but after my junior year, I went out to Los Angeles, and I had money to finance that. I wound up taking 6 months off of school and got out to LA. I was able to get an agent and did some commercial. I auditioned and landed some guest starring roles on TV. And then I stayed, got another couple of parts. And then eventually, a few months later, Happy Days came along. But, I went to a whole slew of auditions and screen test for that. And then got the part of Ralph. And, we shot the pilot, and then found out very quickly that it was going to be a mid-season replacement, and started shooting in like November, and then it was on the air January of '74.
Wow, that's incredible. And has your career led you to a personal encounter with any member of the Beatles?
Well, as a matter of fact, it did. Thank goodness. If I hadn't been on Happy Days, I wouldn't have gotten this opportunity. It was pretty amazing. As I was saying, we got on the air January, and I think it was around our 6th episode. So maybe 3 or 4 shows had been on the air. That's about it. And we're shooting a scene in Arnold's, the drive-in, an interior scene. And Anson Williams, we had a little break in rehearsing the scene, getting ready to shoot it. And Anson went to go get a cup of coffee, and that was near the entrance to the soundstage. And he comes back with this weird expression on his face, and he says, "This guy just walked in, and he says he looks just like," and I won't say who yet, "he looks just like so-and-so." And we're going, yeah, right. This guy's coming here to see us, right? We're laughing, A minute or two later, we see a guy walk in with a young boy. He's got sunglasses on, and we're going, holy shit. It's John Lennon. And Julian was with Julian. And we were like freaking out. We couldn't believe it. What is he doing here? And
Wow.
it turns out, he was taking Julian around in California. And I guess maybe Julian had seen some episodes, and John, being a big fan of 50s music, probably watched it with him, and they wanted to come and meet, and nobody told us they were coming, nothing. They just walked in. So it was crazy. So they stayed for a few hours, and he was so humble and soft spoken and, very, it had an amazing, there was this presence about him that was just so calm and kind of, we were really surprised. And I and then I remember they were watching rehearsal. We talked for a while. We took a picture with him, which people could see on the internet. I have it hanging on my wall. Took an amazing picture, and he was talking to the crew, and Anson told me later, I didn't even know this. He was like, as he was talking with the crew, he was taking little napkins or something and doodling, making little doodles, and he was giving them to the crew. So Anson always says to me now, why didn't we get any of those? We should have gotten some of those, And I wish I did. I wish I had gotten that. But having the picture's pretty awesome, and that experience, I'll never forget. I mean, it was just amazing.
That's so cool.
But then I have to tell you, there was another time where who walks onto the set, because he was shooting a movie nearby. Who walks on and says, but Ringo and starring Keith Moon come in.
Oh, wow.
and I didn't know. All of a sudden I hear some hubbub, and I see Anson and somebody else up in the bleachers, because now it's when we're shooting in front of an audience. This is some years later, and they're in the bleachers talking with Anson and somebody else, and they might have had a few drinks or something, because they just had that feeling, and they were making jokes and just cracking us up, and it was. I wish we'd gotten pictures, but it wasn't back then. It was like, oh, let's pull out your phone. We didn't have phones,
right?
We
Yeah,
didn't have cameras on us, so
right.
I never got a picture of that.
Oh, man.
That was pretty wild.
Do you remember what you said to John and Ringo, or was it just so like in the moment?
Yeah, I don't remember. I mean, I know that I was, I'm pretty shy with people I don't know, and intimidated by that. And there were so many, there was a bunch of us around. So I didn't get to really have like a one-on-one discussion with him. But, I remember shaking hands with him and just saying hello, and a few words of, just niceties, and then listening him just talk to other people and just being around him. I probably didn't exchange more than 2 sentences with him personally, but just listening to him and watching him and talking to the other people, and just being in his presence was pretty amazing, just insane.
Do you have a favorite Beatle?
I don't think so, because they each contributed so much in their own way, and very differently. And I respect and appreciate each of them, what they contributed, because they were all pretty amazing. They all were just incredibly talented. And no, I don't think I have a favorite. I mean, I did love a lot of the stuff that John went on to do later on, but I also liked a lot of what McCartney did, what Paul did later on too. But as a group, when they were together, it wasn't like, when they were together, I didn't really have, there were some people, I like Paul, then probably a lot of girls that initially loved Paul. And then then there were the people who loved George and John and Ringo. But no, I don't have it. I think it was just such an incredible, the blend of these 4 individuals was, magical. And I guess destiny, because the power, the influence that they wound up having over the world, it's amazing. And like I said, they all had talents, and the way I guess a lot of it also had to do with the amount of playing they did together. Before they ever came to the States, they would play, like, I don't know, I heard stories when they were in Germany and all these places prior, doing like 8 shows a day or something, some crazy. So they had all that underneath them, and doing it from a young age, and then they built their skills even more and more, and then their natural talent, and and then they evolved, incredibly so. So yeah, to me it was that magic of the four of them.
How about a favorite Beatles album?
I do have a favorite Beatles album because this is what I alluded to earlier, that it was later that when I really got into their music. And it was when they started progressing out of that earlier sort of rock pop phase. It started getting really interesting. I remember hearing, I think the White Album might have been one, and Sgt. Pepper's and the White Album really started like getting my attention and going, wow, they were like breaking new ground. It was totally, it was so creative, and that's what hit me in a big way, because they were experimenting with different instruments and sounds and recording techniques and their own and their vocals and the style of music. It was so different. But then when when Abbey Road came out, that's what I would say was my favorite album. And it was during a period when I was about probably 16 or something like that, because did it come out around 69?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was around 16, and I was sort of getting into a different phase, just, in terms of growth. I was almost ready for college, or it might've been right around, because I entered college when I just turned 17. So it was around then, you're exposed to different things, and I started getting into that album and just loving it. And to this day, I think it's incredible, and I love everything about Abbey Road. Yeah.
Yeah, me too. That's my favorite Beatles album as well. I just think it's
Oh,
perfect.
yeah, absolutely. That's great. Yeah, we're on the same wavelength there.
Yeah. Especially side 2, Golden Slumbers, and
Oh,
Carry That Weight. I just
oh my
love all that.
God. I know the way those blend into each other is genius.
Yeah.
It's just genius. Oh my God. Yeah, you're right. It's a perfect album.
Do you have a favorite memory associated with the Beatles or their music?
God, a favorite. Well, the John Lennon thing, but I guess that's not the Beatles. I don't know. A favorite memory. That's a tough one. Oh, their music. I think we just touched upon. I think my memories of getting into that album of Abbey Road was, I think it helped me, in some ways influenced me to open up my mind and my, in the terms of seeking creativity and showing the possibilities of expanding your horizons, expanding your consciousness. And that's what they were doing. I mean, I'm sure the consciousness was, expanded by certain things that they indulged in, and it might have helped open up, it was just opening up your mind into new levels, new dimensions. So just my memories of listening to that album, and I remember going to sleep to it a lot, that one summer, and just listening to it over and over before I go to sleep.
I think Abbey Road is the perfect kind of late summer album. When Sun King comes on, I always get like that kind of feeling from that record.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, I mean, the different textures that they did in that album, the different things blending together in ways that you never heard before, and yet they were like, oh, it's great, and how did they come up with this?
Right.
How the hell did they come up with this?
So what do you think it is about the Beatles that makes them so much more than just a band? They're an icon, they exist now when they broke up 60 years ago.
Yeah, well, I think it's some of the things I touched on. It's this something indescribable about the four of them together. And I think their personalities. I mean, they that comes through in a way, and you know, each one of them was great, but the four of them together, it's just beyond great. Then it became something that is like, that's why it became so iconic. The blending of those four talents, the voices, the musicianship that they had and supported each other and pushed each other. I think they Mike's feeling is that they were pushing each other, and that's why they were able to reach heights that they wouldn't have otherwise. So that's I wish, God, I wish I could have been a fly on the wall in the early days before they really became big, watching what was going on between them.
Yeah.
And, I really wish I could have seen them in Germany and in wherever they were in, not Liverpool, but was it Liverpool?
Yeah.
The famous club that they played in,
The
and
Cavern
then
Club.
Cavern, right, and then to see them behind the scenes and see what was going on. I think that had to have been amazing, and so I don't know. It's hard. I wish I could express it better, but it's sometimes hard to describe things that are magical like they were.
So, Don, what are you up to now? What kind of projects have you been involved with recently?
Well, last year I had a very busy year. Even though it was during the pandemic, I did 4 films in like a 6-month period. One is called Lost Heart, which is on Amazon Prime, and it's a really fun and heartfelt movie. I play a small town pastor in it, and a very different kind of role, than people would think of me from Happy Days. And then I also play another movie called MBF, Man's Best Friend. I play a defense attorney representing a wounded vet. It's a pretty heavy film. Again, a different role, which I love. I love playing all different kinds of roles. And then in another one that's coming out this year called County Line, No Fear, I play sort of a low-level career criminal, this low-level criminal guy, but he's kind of a little eccentric, kind of funny, and that was fun. And then I played a king in like a medieval king in another film. And then I've been singing because I went back to that music that I loved. I mean, I love a lot of the music in the 60s too, classic rock, Beatles, and so many other bands from that era. It was a renaissance of music that time, I think, pushing boundaries and mixing styles, and rock with folk and rock with jazz, blues. It all was coming together in different ways. But the music I love, that's in my blood to perform, is the great American songbook with the jazz standards. I do it sometimes with a big band and swing, and it's so much fun. I have an album out called Mostly Swinging, and you could get on iTunes or Amazon. It's with a great big band of some top Los Angeles jazz players, great arrangements. It swings. And I've been doing clubs, in New York. I did 54 Below, a good club, like 4 or 5 times. The Iridium Jazz Club I've played at. I did a concert out here in Los Angeles with a big band, and then I did my first symphony, the Hershey Symphony, and a few months ago, and I just finished recording a new CD. Did it in Nashville this time with a producer who I think is really good, and we're doing a lot of jazz standards, but instead of with a big band, it's a more contemporary jazz setting, like a quintet with maybe some overdubs and some solos from the sax and trumpet. But I'm still singing the jazz standards, so that's going to come out sometime, probably in June or July. We don't have a title yet, but I'm really excited because I think it's really good, really good. So, but in the meantime, people could check out Mostly Swinging, and I'm attached to direct a couple of films. In the past, I've directed 3 independent films. One's called The Last Best Sunday, a pretty heavy drama with two around two teenagers, kind of almost a Romeo and Juliet kind of thing. And then I did a film called Moolah, which is more of a comedy drama. And then I did a nice family film I directed called Harley's Hill. But now I've two projects that I'm very excited about that I'll be directing. We're just trying to get, either it's finding the money, and we have a lot of interest, so it's starting to build, and I'm hoping it'll get to the finish line, and then I'll be behind the camera again doing that, and hopefully acting a lot more, because I love playing so many different kinds of roles. There's another film I did. I mean, think about it. I played a small town pastor. Then I went to playing in another film a polygamist. So I go from a pastor to a polygamist, which is kind of cool. That's called Cult Cartel, that movie. And, and then I said, and then I played, another one I did was I play a prison guard in a film called When George Got Murdered, which is about the George Floyd murder. And that's coming out. I played a prison guard in the facility where Derek Chauvin is being held. And It's really interesting what went down in that facility. Really interesting. So there were black guards that they wouldn't let on the same floor as Derek Chauvin. And so I'm one of the white guards in the facility. So it's pretty interesting. So that's coming out, I think, at the end of May on either Hulu or Amazon. When George Got Murdered is the title of it. So there's, been a lot of stuff going on, and hopefully a lot more to come.
Oh, that's very exciting. I will leave the link to all those things in the podcast description so people can click on it and check them out.
Excellent.
So, Don, I have one more question for you.
Yeah.
Where do you see the Beatles' music and influence in the next 10, 50, or 100 years into the future?
Well, I think definitely going to be the same 10 years from now as it is right now. I don't see it changing. 50 years, a little hard to say, but my guess would be it's still going to be there. Still, and I think 100 years from now, I think it's like Mozart or Beethoven. I think it's going to be there, just like those greats, those immortals. I think they're right up there with that. Yeah,
I agree. I think it'll keep getting passed down from generation to generation, just like everything else.
Yes, it has to. It will.
Don, thank you so much for taking the time and coming on. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Jack, it was an absolute pleasure talking with you. I really, really enjoyed it. Hope to meet you in person someday.
Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Here, There, and Everywhere podcast. Thank you, Don Most, for coming on and for telling your stories. That was amazing. To everyone interested, the links to Don's recent works are in the podcast description below. If you like this episode, please be sure to rate it and subscribe, and be sure to check back in next week for a new guest.